Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, where we explore emerging trends and cultural phenomena. I'm Johannes Kleske. With me, as always, is Igor. Igor, say hi,
Hello.
please. There
Hello.
you go.
Good morning.
And today we're going to talk, I'd say, about more like a fringe topic that seems
Nobody's using them.
We're going for very weak and early signals here. I'm sure most of you haven't yet heard of a company or more like a product called DeepSeek. It came on our radar. Actually, so I think we started playing with it right after Christmas, I think, when they released their first version on the web. And it was like, whoa, what's that? So in the more like AI context. And then they exploded with their new version, I think 2 weeks ago. Was that? I haven't looked at the NVIDIA shares, how they done. I think they've recovered a bit. But everybody's like, okay, they're more where they should be and not where expectations are. So we're talking AI today, in case you didn't notice, and some really interesting context for that. And disruptors, some say, the disruptors getting disrupted. But for us, the really interesting part that we want to look at in the context of DeepSeek is actually open source and local installations of large language models, because there's a lot of interesting things happening there that we think are especially relevant for companies and organizations and individuals, people who are just interested in this stuff and trying it out in their own environments, their own settings, their own context. People who might be, and organizations who might be not happy to use a Chinese web service and send their data there. And for that, we have found the perfect guest to talk about that. Axel Quack is here, longtime friend and collaborator. I remember, like, Axel, when we did we did some form of pitch presentation like 20 years ago or something like that, with a lot of like very organic photography for the slide backgrounds, something like that. That's always something that I have in mind. Is like, I think it's the most effort we ever put into a pitch deck. But that's where we know each other from. Axel, welcome to Follow the Rabbit. How are you today?
Pleasure to join you today. It's an honor. I'm actually following your new format since quite a while, and I'm always impressed by the guests that you invite. And let me do my best to give some insights into AI as well. So happy to be here.
He's being humbled. I mean, in a way, I think Axel introduced us to many things in the tech sector. One of them being, I think, he used Markdown before Markdown was cool. I think he used Markdown before.
Are you sure it's cool right now?
No, but honestly, like
Obsidian says yes.
Yeah. No, but in all honesty, Axel has a very illustrious CV, and if you want, you can look him up on LinkedIn. He has the track record to prove that he can talk about technology extensively, and we're happy that his also, let's say, incessive need to understand complex systems will be useful in our conversation today, because he's been always very interested in open source and local solutions. And in the context of AI, I think the majority of people are experiencing them through a cloud-based service in which they tend to not even understand remotely what is it actually that it's doing. And obviously, beside DeepSeek's ability to be downloaded and installed, one thing that it also introduced into society is this explainability. And I think that explainability is like a tiny window on how we think that those systems can be actually also beneficial to more people, to more organizations being understood for what they actually do. And to that end, obviously, it's also important to kind of think about how do we actually start with this. And so Axel, I mean, we know that you have local installations. You use a lot of those systems locally. Maybe you can give us a small kind of window into what you have done and how you think about this.
And it's, I mean, you mentioned a couple of things, not only using your AI locally, but also you mentioned DeepSeek in particular. But I would like to first start and give a little bit of context about the last couple of years, because I wouldn't have imagined that AI is now so much available for everyone. And it's actually so easy to use, because I think my primary touch points were 6-7 years ago, because there was another attention cycle around AI back then, but it was more towards developers. So it was already easy to use the AI for developers because there was something called Jupyter Notebooks. And this is more known now that Google uses it with Google Colab. But just to explain it in a more simple form, it gives you the chance with a very simple document to code without a lot of coding knowledge. And in between, you can integrate different AIs and so on and try out the different approaches and systems. It was 6-7 years ago where this got a lot of attention. But of course, as I said, this wasn't for everyone. It was mainly for developers, but it was a huge turning point. After that, I think it got more silent, at least from an attention cycle around AI. Yeah. And we all experienced, of course, the change that happened because of ChatGPT. Because OpenAI made it so simple, actually, to use something for a better use case for everyone that we would have imagined before. But when we talk about local running AI, I'm always a little bit skeptical about using something that is owned by one particular company, which was not, as we know, the intention originally from OpenAI, just if we recall the name, OpenAI, because it's pretty much closed. And there's lately some discussion even from Sam Altman if this has to change. So that skepticism in terms also, since I come from an innovation and transformation background, was always there from my side. And I was looking at alternatives that are more open. So you probably know there is, of course, always something in the open source community that we could leverage. And there was something in the beginning called Mistral. Mistral is similar to GPTs from OpenAI, was something that you could run locally. So if you have like a decent machine at home, you had the chance to install it locally and ask the same kind of questions as with OpenAI on a local level. Of course, I have to admit that it wasn't as great and appealing and easy to use as something like ChatGPT. But it was my first touch point actually to run something locally, and because that progressed so quickly in comparison to also a very large company with a lot of VC funding, I got deeper into that game. But let me pause here for a second because I'm not sure if you have a question in between. Otherwise, of course, I can continue going into that direction.
Well, just as a side note, Mistral is a French company, if I remember correctly. And they did receive quite a bit of venture capital as well, I think, in the meantime.
Fairly sad.
Which is,
but it's also based on that, like on the success of their like open source model.
Yeah, but I think that touches a little bit on this kind of point of that there are various kind of solutions, and I've been reading also stories about, for example, the whole DeepSeek context where people dove deeper into the fact that Chinese AI experts aren't actually seeking to be employed by American companies as much as they used to before because of the visa situation, obviously, but other issues as well. So there is also this idea of, well, we can learn, for example, by doing internships in the US, but people tend to go back to China and work on stuff like DeepSeek. And the question, obviously, in this context is there a European kind of version of using AI? And because basically we have paradigms. The US has OpenAI and Anthropic mainly. I mean, obviously other players as well, but those are the two ones that are dominating the conversation. And to a certain extent, I would say they're determining the user experience so far, like they're kind of shaping how we think that those systems should be working. China introduced a different one, which orients in the user experience context very closely to the one that we kind of know from OpenAI, but provides an alternative. And by being just open source, they introduced, I think, thousands of people to this ability to install it locally and kind of do their version. But the question is what should we do in Europe that can help us kind of understand?
Of course, and I mean, jumping into that, and let's go first on DeepSeek and explaining, because there's a lot of criticism, not only in the US around DeepSeek, but you have to have in mind that there are two possibilities to actually use DeepSeek. And one is you just download an application on your for example, mobile phone, and you can just use it, and it runs on a server that is not owned by you, on a machine that is not owned by you.
So it's a web browser and it's a mobile app. I think that's what
it could
have
be
right now.
both. Yeah, both are two opportunities firsthand, and it's like a good to go service, right? Easy to use. But the lack of control
and free to use. I think that's the important part. It's free to use.
Free to use as well. I would say, to compare it with OpenAI, just as a side note of critique, most people don't know if you use the service from OpenAI, and it doesn't matter paid or free, in the settings, you actually, by default, you share your data to enrich and train their system. And that's a lot of criticism as well, because it doesn't necessarily mean it gives context to exactly you, of course not. But it could be something that is trained in there that reveals information that is not for the public and that happened in the past. And that's just a default setting with OpenAI. You should always be critical on the services that you use. And by the way, of course, I also use, out of many others, OpenAI as well. But back to DeepSeek. DeepSeek is the key difference that, as Johannes stated out before, you can basically download the different trained models. There are different sizes of that in terms of trained data. And you can run it locally. You can run it without an internet connection, possibly. You have it in control whenever there's a connection to your own server. That's a huge difference. And of course, it's not only mentioned Mistral, but one of the more popular ones that can be run local is, for instance, Llama by Meta. Is also something that they open sourced before that you can run locally. The next question on that is, of course, how difficult is that to install and run it locally? And there are different approaches. There are even applications that everybody could download easily without a lot of knowledge, like LM Studio. LM Studio is an application for the different operating system that you can just download, and by the press of a button, you can, for instance, install Llama, or I think also now DeepSeek as well, and you can experiment on it locally and with that locally. Of course, that's a little bit dependent in terms of a model size of trained data. If you spotted something like a number behind an LLM, you will see that it's the amount of data it has been trained with. And according to that, it is CPU or a GPU that you need a dedicated graphics card to run those models. And the better they're trained upon the data, usually, very simplified here, the better results you get. But the quality on a decent machine, there are people who now buy. And by the way, I'm a Linux user, so don't get me that I'm making advertisements for Apple. But nowadays, a lot of people buy small Mac Minis, and both CPUs and GPUs are in particular great to run an AI upon. And it's quite decent in terms of speed and experience, what you can do there. So it's very easy with something like LM Studio to run something locally. It's not as complicated that you have to have your own server or anything like that.
Let me just quickly to like sum up a couple of things we mentioned so far. So just to like differentiate a bit. So, I mean, the general thing we have is like, so we're talking large language models, and there are different way how you use them. So there's OpenAI and Anthropic who use them closed source. They have their own like models. They run them on their servers, and there's basically two ways to use them. You can run them in the browser or in the app as their product, or you can access them from different system via an API. So, and you pay for that. But they all run.
I also like how we
service.
I also like how we hate on Gemini.
Gemini, I mean,
just let me quickly like go through that. So this is the model that most people know, like how you use them. And it's also how, if you use other tools who have like an AI functionality, they're usually using OpenAI or Anthropic via an API to use these systems. And then you have open source, which, Mistral is an example. Llama by Meta is an example of these large language models who are open source. You can download them and you can install them locally on servers, on your MacBook, and see how they work. But one thing that I can say is can actually recommend everyone to just try it out, because you will quickly, for example, learn how energy intensive or how processor intensive these large language models or these like AI applications are. And it will teach you a lot about how, like, if you just type some stuff into ChatGPT or Claude and give it a couple of documents, you quickly learn how much energy you need for that. It's a good learning experience. I think these are like the different stuff we talk about today. So we want to talk less about that ChatGPT, Claude, these like closed source models and applications, and are more interested in like the open source model of that, because that allows for much more customization and locally run machines.
And I mean, Igor mentioned also before our stance in the European Union, and in particular with DeepSeek as only one example. I mean, the key benefit of that it's open source is not only that we really see what's happening there, because there's the source code available. Most of the offerings, also from a license perspective, they allow you to even use it commercially. And I think the biggest criticism, at least from my observation out of the US, I mean, you probably have read that they're thinking about forbidding DeepSeek in the US, that you get a huge fine, actually, if you want to install it locally even. And I understand the criticism on the one hand side, because there are rumors. You always need trained data to train the model. And there are rumors that they build upon other existing models that were done from an IP perspective in the US. By the way, as a side note, there's also a lot of criticism where OpenAI trained their data upon.
Yeah.
So I understand
that. Do you like them apples?
But to compare it, I mean, that's I think the most important part. How important AI is, of course, for a government in terms of their economic advantages. And OpenAI, as well as others, you probably have read the announcement, and also from Grok, which is owned by Elon Musk, how much they want to invest into data centers to actually train their own models and further build something like Grok, which is owned by Musk with xAI. And that's where actually the economic standpoint gets super, super important, because on the other hand side, there's now a Chinese model called DeepSeek. And there's another one, by the way, called Qwen from Alibaba, which is also open source. You can also download it and experience it locally. And it's fantastic, by the way. And they open source it. They give it out for free. I mean, that's a huge competition. Talking a little bit about Europe, not only that we always have trouble with data centers that are outside of the European Union or outside of Germany in our case. Of course, you can install those models locally on your data centers in Germany and France by certified players here in the region. But on the other hand side, it gives you the chance now to do it really in a more, I would say, decentralized manner, to install something at your place at home and run it and use it. And it's fantastic. It's wonderful. And you can still integrate the commercial models. There are interfaces like Open Web UI. So just imagine it's like a website that, by the way, looks very similar to the interface of OpenAI. And you can integrate your own models that you run locally. And on the other hand side, you can integrate the commercial models, which are hosted somewhere in a commercial cloud in there as well. And you won't spot the difference. And there are so many advantages besides that. For instance, you can run, for instance, DeepSeek and Grok by xAI, or one of the ChatGPTs or O1 models by OpenAI. You can run them in parallel, and you can ask for the different questions of those models in one interface. You can let them compare their answers. So yeah, I think you spot already my enthusiasm about that. But I think we have the freedom from our perspective to not invest as heavily into AI, but use already what is existing, and making on the one hand side limitations that we have in terms of data centers and so on to our own advantage, and run something locally. But just that as a quick conversation starter, because I could go on in terms of difficulties that we have as well in the European Union from a legal perspective or regulatory perspective as well.
But maybe to make it a little bit like tangible, like do you, well, I mean, on an individual level, if you are a somewhat experienced kind of computer user in terms of like you have looked once or twice at the terminal, and you have kind of some knowledge, how much time does it take for someone who is now curious to have something running on their machine that is not like the latest pimped out kind of MacBook, and what would they be able to do in comparison to what people are used to doing on Claude or something like that?
As always, that's a typical answer. It depends.
It depends.
But the easiest way to actually experience this, as I said before, are applications like LM Studio, because you can just download them. I think there is, of course, a learning curve that you should have anyway, that you should have some knowledge about, because just imagine there are a couple of names of models, AI models, LLMs that you could install, and it doesn't tell you anything. I mean, if there's a name called Gemma, which is the free model in that case by Google, or Phi, which is the model by Microsoft that is open sourced, or Llama by Meta, it doesn't tell you anything. So I think from a user experience perspective, there is, of course, something that could be done better. But to get it running, it's actually quite simple nowadays. And that was different when I started to work on local models like 2-3 years ago. Very different use case and difficulty level. So that's easy. And on the other hand side, you see the results in real time. If you have like an older machine, you probably should know, as I said before, that in terms of the numbers that are always attached to a model, if they're smaller, it means smaller trained data sets. And that uses less CPU or RAM or GPU and at the end performance of your computer. And just try it out. I mean, there are some models which are, even if they are trained on more data sets, which are not as hungry in terms of power and energy and so on. And you can just experience it. So it is good to tinker. And there's so much change going on. I mean, I heard, for instance, the open source model are not as good as XYZ. Because of course, a company like OpenAI, they publish like their new models for paid for actually quite a lot of money if you use their top end products. And suddenly there's a model like open source, like from DeepSeek or Quen from Alibaba, which is not on the radar right now, and they're at least as good as them. And I can give you other examples where it outperforms actually the closed models. Like for instance, if you take something for coding, there are a lot of models which are fabulous, which outperformed like Microsoft Copilot, for instance. And you could use it locally to actually create your own code for programming. It's wonderful.
Yeah. So the one tip that I can give, if you listen to this and you say, this sounds intriguing, I want to try it out, I'm not sure where to start. The obvious answer in our age is just type it into YouTube. Just say, how can I run an open source LLM on my MacBook? And you will get excellent tutorials who will take you through every step that you have to take and teach you all that you have to know to run that. I mean, I think that's what we do. I mean, we have our Axel chatbot that we can just ask questions of how do I do this? And he usually answers with a YouTube video. So, I mean, that's how you do it.
I mean, I was about to say, like, it's either that or ask an LLM. You can type this into Perplexity and let Perplexity help you kind of like build a tutorial into how to do this step by step, which is absolutely fine as a process of getting yourself to setting this up. No, but I mean, okay, so it's pretty easy to download something, try to experimenting. I think expectation management wise, people should be aware that this is not going to be a replacement right out of the box for more complex kind of tasks that they are kind of used to do with OpenAI, for example, but it will generate some form of, results. Now, when I kind of also think about like this topic of like, how do we behave in Europe? Like, how is this, like, do we imagine ourselves that every company has their own kind of NVIDIA box, which they are kind of releasing soon-ish, locally installed in their basement of their office that is now a remote office because nobody wants actually to work in an office anymore. But the point is, like, do we imagine that companies will actually run their own kind of boxes to maintain their system? And I want to kind of like emphasize that on the one hand, I see huge benefits, economic upsides to it. But at the same time, I'm also hesitant to think that this is actually going to happen because we've seen different cycles of open source technologies being available and the availability to companies to run their own web server, to run their own, like a whole stack of things that could be run locally but aren't, because most companies are either not interested in investing the kind of money up front to setting this up in a way that is maintained for them, or, just plainly don't understand what the fuck this is actually doing.
And
so,
let me go and first give a why and more reasons for why doing that. And then let's talk about the how for companies or individuals. From a why perspective, it's also good to know, I'm sure nearly everyone listening has used something like OpenAI. And again, I'm using it as well as one of the different options. But you see, if you have had those conversations with the system, you see the different threads with all the questions that you did before, right? I mean, this is knowledge and you're training the system. There's also an extension where it gets your own memory, right? Because it can fall back to the things that you have asked before. At least they are working on that to make that more seamless. So you're basically training, like already the super brain is trained, that's LLM already supplying. But on top, it's individual knowledge. And that individual knowledge is trained by your question and it's learning about you. And so just imagine if you now want to switch systems, that's difficult because you cannot get that trained knowledge if you used it for a couple of years and go to another system. So there's a huge lock-in. On top of that, training it, there's something called, sorry for the technical terminology, it's more important that you understand what it is, like a RAG. And a RAG is training something on top of that LLM, like GPT-4 or the names that you've probably have heard, on your own data. So you can upload your own documents. Doesn't matter if it's office documents or anything in particular. And that's all knowledge that is locked in within the system. Let's leave aside the access to that data of your trained data sets, but the lock-in itself, that you cannot change the system, that's something super crucial. And as I stated out before, with something like interfaces like OpenWebUI that you can run locally, you can still integrate OpenAI, Grok as a commercial model, Cohere, and so on, besides the open source model, but you own basically the brain that you're training on top of that. And that's a huge reason why there is actually a reason for investing into that, because you want to own it. Just imagine, I mean, if we use it as individuals, that's one thing for 2-3 years. But imagine a smaller company like an SME, 50 to 200 people, and they use it every day. All that knowledge that you create, you don't own it. You cannot actually export it as easily. So I would think about talking about investment here, because let's now talk about the how. I mean, of course, they are already more or less a small company. They run their own data servers in the company to actually store their data sets. I doubt that a lot of companies store everything in the cloud already. So there is a potential, at least, that they can run something locally as well. We're not talking here about supercomputers. And even that might change, because you've probably heard that NVIDIA, they announced like a small computer called Digits, which is a working title, I think, for the machine. And it should be, from a power perspective, a couple 100% more performant for running locally LLMs. And it's, I think, $3,000 just to use that. So, and even if you run some of them in parallel, I think from an investment perspective, in terms of hardware, that's easy. In terms of educating your company, your employers, and making them use that, that's a different beast, because we still have discussions, what do I need it for on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, people completely rely on AI to create basically everything within a small time frame that would usually take you hours and hours and hours of research and so on. Yeah, that's on the how side. Let me extend one more thing, and that's on an individual level, because I had discussions with someone you probably know from an energy perspective that we now have like dynamic tariffs, which basically means you just pay what is the price on the energy market right now. And there is now upcoming that you will need a software at home or in the cloud, same discussion, where you actually do not only the trading of the energy. If you, for instance, with a PV photovoltaic instance, produce your own energy, but also to smartly exchange it within your household to actually spot like, hey, there's a car, I now need this from an energy storage and so on. Sorry for going into that direction. What I'm basically saying is it is a local machine that you need anyway, and why not combine that? Why not combine that with a local running instance of an AI or so? Because you need a machine that could even benefit for something like the energy part as well. So I think there's also a huge opportunity for energy companies and so on to combine that. And that's something that not a lot of people are spotting right now. Sorry, that's two examples on the how.
And let me give like one super like personal, like simple example. So I use Obsidian as my note-taking tool, and I've used it for years. It has a lot of notes on projects, on ideas. It has all via Readwise. It has all my highlights of the last 15 years of every book I read, every article I read, like all the highlights that I marked. It's all in there. I don't want to upload this thing to ChatGPT or Claude. So this is like the perfect example of I have it locally on my MacBook. I can run like an indexing on those notes and can then access those notes via a locally installed LLM with an interface like OpenWebUI to just ask questions of that and see what's in there and what I can use and what comes to mind and remind me of, oh, I already did something about this like 5 years ago and it's connected to that. This is a perfect example of where you don't want to upload some knowledge that you've created over years and now think that that's just me. Like think of a 50-person company who has done a lot of projects and things like this.
Well, I think I'm going to be the guy who disagrees with both of you in the sense that this is a perfect example of nerds being nerds and are kind of doing their own thing, and it's not a really scalable solution. And to kind of pick up on this, first of all, most people in their work environments, I mean, there is a reason why Microsoft is making more money with selling Office than Windows. And the reason being is that it provides an out-of-the-box solution, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure that most people are spending more time at like administrating user accounts in Office because that's a hellhole for itself. But there
Even talking about Teams.
Yeah. And I mean, there are plenty of open source alternatives to Microsoft Office or Google Docs, and yet both of the services enjoy a huge amount of popularity. And to the extent of the example that you provided, Axel, I mean, there's the memory function, and I get what you're trying to say. Like every time you use it, you train the system. But I think the illusion that is often maintained in those services, and I think like, social media services, etc., had the same curve of illusion that for the first couple of years, it seems like the benefits for the user are still higher than the benefits for the system that you train. And so you end up being, well, yes, of course, I'm training the system. Although I think most people are not aware of that fact every single time that they use it, because on a cognition level, you're like, I'm just trying to get through the day. I'm just trying to do this small thing. And suddenly they enable this memory feature, and it actually knows what I said 3 months ago that I don't remember anymore. And instantly you have a benefit. And so what I'm trying to say is, and I mean, we wanted to have this conversation because I am definitely a proponent of the fact that there is so much potential here, especially for smaller organizations to do their thing without the requirements of the system. But somehow we still didn't crack the thing that would make open source into a mass appeal. The fact that we're training systems doesn't get the needle going.
Yeah. To comment a little bit on that, and I fully agree in terms of the examples given. I mean, I tried with LM Studio to keep it with a simple example, and the ones that we dropped in between are definitely not simple. The key difference is, I think, the acceleration nowadays, that it becomes simple, they are huge, because I could give you another example that is more easier on training your own data. Maybe some people, they buy something like a NAS, which is basically a couple of hard drives, and you attach them to your computer. There are companies like Synology or any other, and it's also for creatives if they want to store their data and it's not enough space on their machine. They just buy a machine, they attach it to their computer, done. There's a company, and nearly all of them are following right now, that I also bought a NAS from, called ZimaCube. You basically start the system, you have an interface, you can attach it with a cable to your computer, it gets mounted, and so on. The interesting part is when you store your data upon there, it runs a local LLM, open source LLMs, and it's already training the data. So if you're searching on that machine for a file or so, it doesn't only find, for instance, by a file name or some metadata, it can actually go through images. It can actually observe the images and can tell you, hey, this is on the image. It can go through videos on there and can index it and so on. And that's already trained by the system. So you don't have to be a pro to set it up. It's now by nature that when you buy it, you press a button, it's on, and it trains it. That's of course not, it is all locally. There's nothing in communication towards an external server and so on. But the data gets trained by itself without a lot of knowledge. I'm not sure if it's a perfect example because it's brand new. They launched that feature, I think, like 1 month ago, and I talked with them about it with one of the founders like a year ago. But again, I think the possibilities and the acceleration of simplicity, that's something that made, for instance, OpenAI successful. Because as I stated out before, a couple of years back, it was just too complicated to use it. So that's definitely something that has to arise so that everybody uses it. In terms of benefits from a system like that, I mean, Johannes mentioned Obsidian and training your own or keeping your own data in there. You have to be very disciplined to actually bring your data into the right format. We're using Markdown as nerds and so on. Benefit from that because you basically can rely on that data and train it. But how many people actually take the time to be in a specific format and so on? They just have some spreadsheets, some Word documents or whatever. But again, this is also changing right now because you can basically train in future more or less automatically with the ZimaCube example by just whatever data you have. And then you can extract that knowledge. And
I hope we would get exactly to that point in the sense that there is what is different now, I feel. I mean, I used like 20 years ago or something like that, I used to run my own Linux on my notebook. And I would be that, asshole really, who would run a Linux installation on his agency. I was an employee of an agency and I would run my own Linux on it. And that would mean that my colleagues had to print stuff on the office printer because that wouldn't work. It's just like, it was really difficult. It was really cumbersome. But I think in a way that the thing that I see right now is that before it was always a choice between freedom and a lock-in thing. But the lock-in thing would give you instant features, instant usability, instant kind of like ability to do this. LLMs in a way could potentially, replace the interface problem because if it's trained and you can talk to it, it actually doesn't require an interface that much. And that creates this jump from, this is an open solution and it provides me security, it provides me the ability to train my own system without training somebody else's system. But it was like, as a paradigm, it was just, yes, but I mean, I need so much time to teach everyone, like teach every employee what to look for, like teach a different interface, because people who join a new company, if it's say a 30-person company, they usually use either Google Docs or Microsoft systems. If they switch to another system, you suddenly need to teach them how to use the open source solution. That takes time. It's expensive. Nobody wants to do it. We're kind of switching into a mode where if you run this locally and you talk to your system, you can suddenly have this, and this is a future scenario really, where you have system that you talk to, the interface changes, but you have your own box. And even if that box is still maintained in some server somewhere, like by a company like Hetzner, who kind of runs it for you, it is still yours. And I think there's, on a European level at least, we might not be able to train our own systems like China does. But the reason that this is not a problem for us in a way is that China does want to disrupt the kind of like status quo of American technology companies, and they're doing that through open source solutions. And that provides us with at least a jumping off point. I mean, we also have Mistral, we have Aleph Alpha for whatever that does as good. And I think like there is this kind of, for me, there is certainly, and despite the fact that I was disagreeing before a bit, I wanted to get to a point like the interface, user behavior, all those things are changing, and they can be changing in a way that makes suddenly open system viable in a way that didn't before.
I mean, there are a couple of thoughts on that in terms of from a European perspective. First, from an investment amount, I mean, they're now by the European Union. I think last week there was an announcement on 2 different funds that they want to build around AI. And just by a sheer size, they were either in the lower 2 digits billion amount that they want to spend over the decade, I think was the terminology used. Just in comparison, if you want to build data centers at large to train those models initially, and also by an energy consumption level where you need just sheer endless energy sources to actually train those models, that's one thing. But the amount of money, I mean, we've heard now with a collaboration through SoftBank as one of the investors with OpenAI and Oracle and so on, they want to invest, if true or not, within the next years, $500 billion. I think similar sizes in at least the larger rounds, triple digit billion rounds were done by XAI already. In comparison to that, the amount that they want to spend over a decade within Europe, at least from a government perspective, is very small in terms of size. And I'm not talking about energy consumption and so on, and how to actually feed those machines at the end. So I'm not sure if that's a good way on trying to copy what China is doing or the US is doing in terms of building the data centers and training your own LLMs, while on the other hand side, we can build products and services on existing models that are free to use and commercially as well. So that's a strategic discussion, of course. From a labor and talent discussion, oh no, let me first answer a second thing in terms of innovation and progression and how fast things are accelerating. 2 years ago, professionally, I built a demo basically on agent models. So just imagine we came up with a demo where you can basically tell in different steps, I need a researcher, and you train an AI and that's your researcher, and it goes out and comes back with results. And we played it with a couple of different examples on the coder, researcher, and so on. So if you did something like that, it is not only asking actively the AI for something, the AI automatically comes back to you. So it's like not a push, it's a pull, actually. Is it the right order? I don't know. Anyway, and that is now the biggest product of a company, right? And so within 2 years, that became very real at scale in a real product that now customers are trained upon at large. So that's where I'm surprised, even from an innovation standpoint, how quickly those things change and are simplified. Yeah. Lastly, in terms of talent, European talent, it's also impressive. We talked a lot about more text generation, LLMs, image generation. That's something where I also started with in the beginning, something probably know DALL-E as something where you can type in a multimodal model where you type in a text and it creates an image for you in response. And there's something also in the open source community just right from the start called Stable Diffusion. And they competed a lot with DALL-E in the beginning, at least. What people didn't spot is that some of the folks from within Stable Diffusion, from that open source team, they founded a company called Black Forest Labs. And Black Forest Labs, as their name probably tells, they're German. They created also another open source model for image creation called Flux1. Flux1 is now used by XAI for image generation for Grok. So they basically they still own that company, it's still open source. They hired those folks, they flew them into the valley. They're sitting there right now, and they are the ones who do the image generation for a very, very good offering within XAI or Grok in that case. So I think we do have the talent. We see it with Mistral, we see it with Flux and a bunch of others. But on the downside, I would say we have a lot of limitations. I come from financial services innovation in particular, and I had to deal, of course, with the AI Act, which is very, very complicated by the European Union a lot. And it's, of course, slowing us down. So people, in terms of talent, they want to create something and they go somewhere where they can create more easily. That's unfortunately the downside, why we probably concentrate more upon building data centers and so on, and not in terms of creative usage of something that is existing already, in terms of how can we actually not block people. And I'm also critical, as you spotted, in terms of data and owning data and so on. So I don't want to neglect it, but everything is bad, but it's very complicated and it's slowing us down while the rest of the world is really accelerating a lot.
Let me quickly just sum up some things that I also heard you just mention that I think are really important, like in this whole discussion. I mean, it's also like, why did we want to talk about this, and why did we want to talk especially about open source and LLMs? And I think there are like different levels to it. The one thing is that if you even have like an inch of nerdtum in yourself, try that out. That's like, I think my personal, and I think you guys also like, as I play with these things because they change your relationship to AI. Because so much of our discussion is super abstract because we use ChatGPT or Claude and it feels very magically and sometimes very weird, but we don't feel we have any agency in that. So playing with these like local installations, they say, oh, okay, so I start to understand what is a model. Axel keeps on mentioning, you also understand what different parameter sizes of models produce, like how much processor do they use, how different the results are that they use. You just learn about these things, and they give you better understanding for that. And that usually can lead to that you get more like concrete ideas. Oh, I can actually use something like this with that. And my example of using like a local installation to look into my Obsidian nodes is mostly just an example, like a playful thing. But once you've done that and, I have to do this and I have to install this, and then it takes so much time to index that. Okay, interesting. You can scale it up and say, okay, how is it when I use it on a company knowledge thing? So when you talked about that, I remembered like discussions from like 10, 15 years ago was like, what if the internet is just a search field? The intranet, the internal intranet is just a search field. That was like when search was all the rage. So, and right now you can very easily imagine, of course, you have your Word, Office documents and stuff like that. But you always have your internet. What if it's just like a chat window or something like that? But that's just the beginning. We keep mentioning Perplexity, which I think is a really good example of the stuff that I think we haven't much talked about, that is actually product development. Because that, I think, is really interesting. Because once you better understand the technology, it helps you to understand or think about actual product development. What can I build with this? And not just how can we use our internal documents better, but what products can I build with them, or how can I implement them? And I think Perplexity is a good example of them using all kinds of different models, also using their own models to create like a search and understanding product. And they just, with the release of DeepSeek, and DeepSeek being very strong in reasoning, like explaining what it thinks it should do to you and then doing exactly that. And so they've been able to get DeepSeek inside of their product by downloading or like getting the open source model and installing it on US servers. Because of course they don't, as a US company, don't want to send the data to the Chinese servers, but they could just install the open source model, run it on their own servers. And now you have an actually even more improved product that has very good reasoning built in. And you have to say, okay, this is how you can use these. And you can also use Claude. You can use different GPT models. You can see how they can combine. I think and that is like just like one of those examples. I mean, they're going to have some problems now when you're using DeepSeek. That would be 100 million fine. But this is the thing that for me, it's like the important part. Like, how can we get from, I always say, like these feuilleton discussions about AI and what it means and is it the future and will it replace everyone, to a much more hands-on understanding what's actually happening there and what are the implications of that and what products we can build with that. And also, like you said, what are the bigger discussions of how does it work in the EU? How's the regulation like limiting the approach? How should the regulation change once we have much more hands-on experience with that?
And you raised a very important point. And if you want to start as a company, we also talked about SMEs and so on and investments there. And I gave examples with digits or so from a hardware perspective that it's not a huge investment. Then the question is with your employees, the European Union is thinking about doing some sort of driver's license that you're allowed to use AI as a company. So only if you have that driver's license as a company, you will be allowed to use AI. It's not the best approach because I would prefer that as a company, you try to encourage your employees to be curious about AI and to try it out and to tinker with that because it's so quickly changing. I know from a personal perspective, someone I know had like an educational program on AI and they were telling like, oh yeah, it was open source. It's not socially acceptable on the one hand side because you have to pay for the good models and the open source ones, they're not as good. And then on the next day, actually DeepSeek hit and it outperformed the highest paid models from companies. So it's quickly it's changing so quickly that the only thing to survive in those regards is if you try things out yourself and you don't wait for someone who's educating you 24/7 or so. You have to start to just use it. In that case, maybe it doesn't matter firsthand if it's a paid service or not, or something running in the cloud or locally. But then as a next thing, you have to train yourself on what is happening there and what is the advantage and the disadvantage of using a certain thing and maybe the risk of doing so. But that's part of a learning process. So that's what I would encourage instead of a driver's license.
Well, I'm certainly not in favor of the driver's license, and I want to thank everyone who is still listening to have stuck with us and the amount of acronyms and names that we kind of used in the process of creating this episode.
You can all look them up in Perplexity.
Yes, indeed. We can share maybe this time around the transcript and make it easier for people to kind of look through it. I have to say, I agree with most of what you're saying, with the only difference that it really reminds me of my own talking points when we started out talking about social media. And everyone was basically saying, well, there's really no way other than, trying and kind of like using those systems. And what we ended up being is locked into media ecosystems that are dominating how politics works, how economies work, how polarization is exuberant. And I think that to the extent of that we need to try this out, I think one of the reasons why we also wanted to do this particular episode is that obviously there is this narrative about this is magic. Like Apple is the company that used this terminology and all those systems. If you are not technically versed and you have no ability to understand, like they seem like magic, which is in a way true. Like, if you don't know how this works, you type something in and it provides you like this really extensive answer. What's the difference to magic? It is magic. But if anything, what we are seeing, I think, is this ability to actually use and experiment with open solutions this time around that are actually not less kind of like it's not the downside. Like you're not like not using features. There's so much, like the bar is lowered to an extent of imagining in distributed locally run LLM system for either one company or a set of smaller companies that are pulling something together. There are basically solutions out there that we would like to see more, because from a European perspective, while we have a lot of downsides, the plurality of things that we enjoy here is also a benefit. And we would hope that it's not just a driver's license, but actually the experimentation with open system that will lead to a more interesting environment in which Europe doesn't need to be just the place where things aren't possible.
I think what this reminds me, like listening to it, I was like, what it actually reminds me is of the whole everybody needs to learn how to code thing from a couple of years ago.
A decade,
which is which is funny because that's the first thing that all these LLMs have become so amazing at. Like if you look into that, the things that I can do with very rudimentary understanding of coding is crazy. It's like, but nevertheless, I think the notion back then was still right. I think everybody profits from understanding how programming works, how programming languages work to a certain degree. It helps you, again, to look under the hood and have a rough understanding of what's happening there. And if you, I mean, like, I think what coders love more than anything is a product manager who has a certain understanding of coding and thus can translate ideas right away and stuff like that. And I think this is, to a certain degree, a similar thing where we're saying it's not learn to code, but learn to LLM. I don't know. Sounds weird.
Learn to ask the right questions.
So, and that's... yeah. And I think that's just helpful. And then, we're talking right now, coming from the context of DeepSeek, which was this fascinating, almost event like 2 weeks ago, where this huge narrative of it's all about frontier models, it's all about GPUs, and you see that shifting now. Like yesterday I read the story that so OpenAI released, I think for their top tier users, released Deep Search. It's like an agentic research engine. Then Hugging Face, like this open source platform, the team from Hugging Face, it took them 24 hours to build an open or like version of that is almost as good as the product from OpenAI. And I think this shows you there's a shift from, they are not the big foundation models are no longer the thing that's all about. It's going more towards product development. It's going more towards interfaces. And I think that's a really fascinating time right now, because I think there is more possibility, more agency for smaller companies, developers who can now build products on top of that. And I think that's an interesting development. We're going to see where it takes us in the next couple of months, but it's just fascinating right now.
And maybe as a last comment from my side, also in terms of learning programming and so on, and all the discussions that happened within the last years, for me, it's rather a question where I would encourage everybody to take the difference between instant gratification and delayed gratification. And instant gratification is, of course, always something like, hey, you open an interface like OpenAI and it just works immediately and you don't have to know what it is. While delayed gratification is sometimes more complex, sometimes more painful. You don't have to know all the details, but you don't get the benefits immediately. And you should invest in general. I think that's even outside, of course, of an AI topic, into a delayed gratification and go through a little bit of pain. Because if you understand on a meta level, like programming or so, then you don't have to know the details. What is the difference between a programming language like C or Rust or whatever? It doesn't matter. The AI will create that for you. But if you understand very basic things, you're in full control to actually steer that. And that's a key difference, I think, between the coding a couple of years where you had to do a really, really deep dive on every level, while now you have to be at least informed on a meta level. But it's still delayed gratification. It's not immediately that you get a payoff out of that.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Delayed gratification, a little bit of pain, and maybe a touch more curiosity, I would say. Like, I think there's this saying, like, the stay curious, I think, in a way that more, like, people aren't curious enough about how those systems work. And I think in the age of AI is a great opportunity to be a little bit more curious, invest into that delayed gratification, because it will definitely provide a lot of benefits for those who do. Again, thank you for sticking around for the probably most nerdy episode of Follow the Rabbit so far. And then we've talked about GLP-1, so that's a bar set high. Thank you to Axel for doing this with us. We might bring you back in like 6 months or so and have a whole review of what the fuck has changed in the meantime. Until then, thank you for listening. If you thought this was, understandable, and you think somebody else should benefit from the ideas we discussed here, please recommend the episode to a friend or a colleague. That helps a lot. Until then, see you around.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.